Got something to say? Get in on the conversation at 415-915-2291. That's 415-915-CALL-1.
Welcome to Conspiracies Against Wellness with your host, Janelle Elgoway.
Good evening and welcome to Conspiracies Against Wellness. I'm your host, Janelle Elgoway. Tonight, our guest is Dr. Steve Henson. He will be joining us. If you have a question for Dr. Henson, please call in at 415-915-2291. You can also listen and chat live with our audience from our YouTube channel, Conspiracies Against Wellness livestream. Next week's lineup is Dr. Klein in the Doctor's Corner on Tuesday, and Erin Elizabeth from Health Nut News will be Wednesday's guest. Erin will also discuss her personal struggle with Lyme disease. And now for tonight, welcome Dr. Henson to Con Nation. How are you this evening?
I'm doing very well, Janelle. Thank you for inviting me to be on your show.
Well, we are so happy to have you. So would you mind telling me a little bit about your professional and personal background to start off with?
Well, certainly. I'll start with my personal background. I was born with a congenital heart defect in 1961, and so the science was limited at that time. Ventricular septal defect is considered a hole in the heart between the left ventricle and the right ventricle, and so it causes a shunting of oxygenated blood to the unoxygenated side. So the treatment at that time was basically sedentary lifestyle and an EKG every week. Didn't know what it meant. Nowadays, if you had a child that had a VSD, they would wait until they were 1 year old to gain some weight, and they did open heart surgery and repair the defect. But mine spontaneously closed.
Oh, wow.
Nonetheless, I spent most of my youth either getting EKGs or getting penicillin every time my nose ran, because that was the going science in 1961, is you got to treat everything as if it's going to cause endocarditis in a kid with a congenital heart defect.
Yeah.
So
Wow.
I kind of grew up inside of a hospital that didn't have any medical personnel in my family.
So were you
And
like
then
the
as I grew
the
up-
bubble boy almost? Like kind of like that? Like you remember that movie?
Well, I was in oxygen tent a lot of the time, but typically what you would notice on a congenital heart patient is they would have a bluish discoloration because they weren't getting oxygenated blood distributed throughout the body. But in my case, there was enough pressure that it closed it like a trap door and eventually scarred down. And so now, basically the only remnant of such a disease in me is that it causes a right bundle branch block on my EKG that causes people to freak out if they don't know my history. They're like, oh my gosh, your electrical system is out of whack here.
I bet.
Well, no problem.
Mm-hmm.
So that's kind of a miracle in and of itself that my VSD spontaneously closed.
Okay. Wow. Where are you from? What state are you from?
I'm from Kansas.
Okay.
Born in Kansas City, grew up in a small town called Henson, and I live in Wichita, Kansas now.
Okay. Oh, get a lot of tornadoes there?
We are Yellow Brick Road, and home of Dorothy is Liberal, Kansas. So, yes, we do see a lot of tornadoes. In fact, my hometown was hit by an F5,
Oh, my goodness.
which is a 200-mile-an-hour tornado several years ago.
Okay. Wow. That's scary. Okay. So tell me now. Go ahead. What about kids?
Then I went to, given that I had multiple surgeries growing up as an athlete, you know, broken bones and stitches and whatnot, then I went to college and played basketball. Was an All-American basketball player there and studied pre-med.
Awesome.
Funny thing in school, as you probably experienced when you were going through school as an athlete, is when I told them I wanted to study pre-med, which is a course curriculum geared towards matriculating to medical school. I was taking biology and chemistry were my majors.
Okay.
The instructors, a couple of them said, you cannot play basketball and do a pre-medicine curriculum because you can't miss the labs. And I said, well, has anybody ever done that before?
Uh-huh.
And they said, no, but we don't want you to be a failure. And I said, well, let me try both, if you will. And if it starts to impact my schooling, first thing I'll do is drop out of basketball, which I loved, because that was going to be, I'm not going to head toward the NBA, 6'1" white guy. So I, after the first year, and then after the second year, I'm 4.0, and all of a sudden they're talking about this student athlete that we love to have in our chemistry and biology department. And I said, you shouldn't ever put a restriction in front of someone because they'll try to achieve it then.
Yeah.
And that's exactly what happened.
Good for
And
you.
so then I went to and then I was accepted into medical school at the University of Kansas after my junior year in college, with still a year to go. And my uncle was a Navy recruiter, and he said, you ought to consider going to Uniformed Services Health Profession Scholarship program, so I became a Navy officer. It was kind of funny because with my congenital heart defect, it never restricted me. I played college basketball and ran marathon.
I can't believe that.
And so I went.
That's amazing.
I went to get this physical at the MEPS station, which is they had to send me then about 30 miles north in a taxi to see a Navy cardiologist. And he had a straw hat on and a cigar in his mouth, and he put his feet up on the desk and he listened to my chest. And he said, "You got a murmur." I said, "Yeah, that's my VSD." And he said, "But I'm reading your CV here, and it says you run marathons and played college basketball." And I said, "Yes, sir." And I'm trying to be very professional because I'm trying to get in the Navy. And he said, listens to me, checks my weight, pulses and cursory examination, and says, "Hell, there ain't nothing the Navy can do to hurt you." He said, "I think you're in better shape than most of these guys."
Wow.
So I'm in the Navy for 4 years. During medical school, I loved it.
Yeah.
I got to spend time at active duty. And then my fourth year of medical school, I'm out at National Naval Hospital for my annual physical. They do one every year. And a commander did my cursory examination to sign off and said, "You got a murmur?" And I said, "Yes, same one since birth, congenital VSD." And he goes, "Wow." He said, "I don't think you can serve active duty," which is my payback.
Right.
And I said, "Why is that?" And he said, "Well, Boyle's law, at altitude, your heart will expand if you're in an unpressurized cabin like Payne Stewart.
Yeah.
So your heart will expand 5 times, and it could pull that VSD apart like Velcro, if you will, and your heart could explode." And I said, I was already a pilot at that time and in air medicine, and I just said, I wouldn't be the only one that was in trouble if we were flying at altitude in an unpressurized cabin.
Right.
We'd all go to sleep and freeze.
Right.
Anyway, the commander said I had 3 options. I could have open heart surgery while I was there at the National Naval Hospital. Great. I could take a medical discharge and go to a VA hospital the rest of my life, or I could take an honorable discharge and just walk away. And I said, "What would you do, Commander?" And he said, "Pack your bags." So maybe kicks me out then because I didn't want to have open heart surgery and I didn't need it. So interesting that how my VSD came back up. Didn't ever cause me any issues, has never caused me any issues.
Yeah.
I'm active and healthy now, still athletic, so
Well, good
just
for
an
you.
interesting aspect
it's
of
almost like a miracle.
Healing.
Yeah, yeah, interesting.
Oh, yeah,
and the
absolutely.
body can be an amazing thing. I went through similar stuff like you were saying, but I had a broken neck since I was 16. But I went on to play, in the Olympics for field hockey, and then at Ohio State. And
Right.
It's amazing what you can do when you want to. So
The body is a extraordinary complexity of organs and networks. In fact, what's fascinating to me, as I learned in medical school, is that, in my particular Christian belief, is that we are all created as babies with endogenous opioid receptors and endocannabinoid receptors. So that means every organ of your body has receptors capable of taking on the marijuana plant, which is CBD or THC, and poppy plant, which is opioids. Opioids. We are created for that reason.
Interesting. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, and I want to get more into that in a little bit here. When we spoke to talk about, what we were going to talk about tonight, you were talking about altruistic aspect of medicine. Can you share what that is? And is that what you kind of focused on, or what is that exactly?
Right. The altruistic aspect of medicine, some people try to say it's the Hippocratic Oath, which is what every medical student takes that oath upon graduation, although they're trying to do away with the Hippocratic Oath now. And that is a Latin phrase which just means nocum non sincere, which means above all else do no harm.
Right.
You're not supposed to harm patients, and you're supposed to have their best interests at heart. It's probably better and more concisely talked about when you consider that the two charges that a healthcare provider, specifically I'll say a physician, but it could be PAs, nurse practitioners, the two tasks that they really have in patient interaction is one, to save lives, and two is to relieve suffering.
Why would they want to take it away?
All else,
I'm so sorry.
well, to me, now that you're taking away options, it would be analogous to taking away insulin from diabetics. We're taking away an option that we know that works for you and helps you live your life better. We're taking away cholesterol medication because we just don't think it's worthy anymore. That makes no sense to take something away that helps improve one's life.
Right. Who's trying to take away the
Medicine
Hippocratic Oath?
Medicine is a service business.
Yes.
And it should be always as a servant heart that you're trying to do the best that you can for all your patients. Okay. And sometimes, I'll just be frank with you, as a career emergency physician, sometimes the best thing I can do is know that somebody has a ruptured aorta, and I know they're going to die, and there's nothing I can do about it. But sometimes the best thing I can do is just hold their hand so they're not alone when they're dying.
Right.
We have our gifts, and sometimes it's just being a listener or being there.
Yeah, and you mentioned that, if you want to know something about your patient, all you have to do is sit there and listen. Can you share and talk about
I did that. Yes.
Yeah.
I had a tremendous history of medicine professor at the University of Kansas. And he taught us, he was a soothsayer, if you will, told us there are going to be many, many different types of technology that will come along in your lifetime, in your careers. And he referenced Star Trek, where Doc used the tricoder and could just scan your body and tell you everything that was wrong with you on a screen. He said there will be scans that will look inside of you without any invasion, alluding to CTs and MRIs, which were not available when I first came through. It was standard X-rays and suction cup EKGs. But he said, what has matriculated down through time for 6,000 years, from China to Egypt, is that doctors best treated their patients by simply listening. He said you'll get to a point now where doctors tend to have an answer quickly, and so they'll cut off a patient who's trying to tell them what's going on. Oh, I got something for that, because they're pushed on their schedule. So they just want to write a prescription to get them out the door.
Right.
But if a doctor would sit and listen, the patient would tell them exactly what was going on.
Okay. Interesting.
And that was just a fascinating walk through history.
Yeah. Well, and especially now today, doctors are just, time doesn't seem to be on the patient's side or the doctor's side, so they're kind of pushing everybody through. So how are you supposed to do that then? Yeah.
Concierge medicine is probably the best way to address that, because currently a primary care physician and primary care physicians, general practitioners, family practitioners, they prescribe 90% of all pain medications, and they prescribe about 90% of all psychiatric medications, whether it's antidepressants or anti-anxiety medications, antipsychotic medications. So primary care doctors, though, used to have to go to hospitals and do rounds and then come do their office. And so now they have hospitalists, which has taken some burden off. But primary care physicians now don't have any buffer in their schedule. So if they had 6 appointments scheduled per hour, they used to have 2 that were kept open in case somebody with pneumonia or high fever needed to get an appointment emergently. Now they don't. So their schedule is packed to the point that they'll penalize you if you don't show up for your appointment.
Yes.
Dollars wise, or, even kick you out of the practice.
Right.
But it's put a real burden. But concierge medicine then has allowed, it's a kind of a new concept that's been around for several years, and that's what I base my practice in pain management on, is you take a select number of patients that you can address individually. They just pay a monthly fee, typically nominal fee, and you address all their concerns. They also have major medical outside of that in case they have to go in and get their gallbladder removed or, bypass surgery. But otherwise, you take care of all their medical needs. Many of them have their own pharmacies in-house, so you can take care of kind of soup to nuts all their medical needs at a low cost that isn't prohibitive to the patient or even the family. A lot of concierge families.
Yeah. Okay. Interesting.
It's a great concept where you can only have 500 patients instead of 3,000, and you'll see them. They communicate on text on their own personal phones, which is how really you should communicate. And they will get a patient into an appointment within 24 hours, and they'll even do house calls if you got to come to your house and suture you up or suture your dog up.
Wow. Now, how many of those are in the United States?
It's a concept of service.
Yeah. Are there a lot of...
How many concierge doctors?
Yeah. Are there a lot?
Oh, yeah. There's a whole new concept now, and actually AAPS, American Association of Physicians and Surgeons, now kind of that is their teaching model. Dr. Josh Umbear is probably the forerunner of all concierge medicine, and he happens to be in my hometown of Wichita, Kansas, but he's talked about he's spoken before Congress, and he's been on Sean Hannity's show before as the model of healthcare, because it isn't cost prohibitive to patients, and it's easy access when you need it most.
Do you think that will become even more popular because of this new atmosphere that we're in? Well, not new, but the atmosphere we're in currently.
Yes, it has to, because doctors cannot continue to run on this treadmill of seeing 3,000 patients.
Right.
See 500, see them within 24 hours, and have a lifestyle.
Yeah.
They make just as much money in concierge medicine as they would having a full practice. But right now, the frustration for a primary care doctor, or any specialist for that matter, is they would have to have 7 ancillary staff members. Used to be that you could have your office, you and maybe your spouse was a nurse or a medical assistant, and you could have an office with 1 person or 2 people. In fact, they did house calls. They'd come and take care of everything at your house, give you a shot of penicillin, leave you a prescription. Now, every primary care physician needs a staff of 6 to do all the paperwork, the history, the HIPAA stuff, the compliance, the insurance, and lab. That 6 people, you have to put a lot of patients through to cover that amount of money that's necessary to pay all those people.
Yeah, absolutely.
So concierge medicine is booming and will continue to boom, because that's how you can take care of all the people.
Yeah. Well, good. I kind of like that. It sounds. I would want to be a patient.
It's a tremendous concept. Yeah. You would absolutely. I think every patient would want to be a concierge patient.
Yeah, absolutely. You also, I don't know, did you create Medical Missions Outreach, or were you a part of that? Can you talk about that a little bit? Mm-hmm.
Certainly. Medical Missions Outreach is a tremendous organization. It started out a concept at Pensacola Christian College, which is a Christian college down in Pensacola, Florida, where a couple of my friends, one was a nurse practitioner and one was in divinity studies or pastoral studies, said this would be a great concept to be able to take benevolent care to places that didn't have access to care. They started doing that inside the U.S. because, believe it or not, there are many foreign mission fields right here in the United States. Mm-hmm. And they started doing that, and then they developed a they developed a working relationship with both Pensacola Christian College and Bob Jones University in South Carolina, to where that could provide additional training for nursing students and allied health professionals to see what it's like to see how medicine is practiced in foreign countries, and also see some disease processes like malaria that you wouldn't typically see in Pensacola, Florida, or Wichita, Kansas.
Okay.
So you get a wide breadth of how medicine is practiced and how medicine developed out of a servant model that was evidenced for us with Luke, the physician, one of the original disciples.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Now, what countries did you go to, and like what kind of surgeries did you do in other countries?
Well, I've been to Africa 4 times, and I've been to Malaysia, Cambodia, Vietnam, Romania, Mexico, Central America, several states there, and South America. Most interesting places probably were Santiago, Chile, because it's so far south, but had medical schools, dental schools, automobile dealerships, everything. But you know what people look like in South America are typically a little olive-skinned. I was shocked because I had traveled to Europe before, but in Santiago, Chile, a lot of blonde-haired, blue-eyed people.
Yeah, the mountains.
They had immigrated from. Well, they had immigrated from Poland and Europe during the war.
Okay, interesting. What kind of pain
very
management?
interesting people, but they were very modern.
I bet. And what kind of pain management is in other countries, and how do they see our pain management? How do they think of that?
Well, they think the U.S. is lucky that we have all the tools available to treat pain. Pain is a kind of a untreated concept in other countries because they basically have Mobic, which is a COX-2 inhibitor, an anti-inflammatory, like Motrin, if you will. They have Panadol, and they have acetaminophen. We're seeing more and more Ultram or Tramadol in foreign countries, South America and Africa, and I think that's because it's kind of fallen out of favor in the United States. But you're seeing a little bit of Ultram, which is not technically an opioid. We do mostly primary care medicine in foreign countries. When we do have access to surgical gases and or lights, i.e. a hospital facility, we do surgeries. We have a surgery center in Honduras now that can do outpatient surgeries like hernias, cataracts, cleft lips, cleft palates, gallbladders, anything that would require maybe an overnight stay is all, but not an extended hospitalization.
So how do people from other countries view the opioid crisis, and doctors? I mean, what do they think of all this that's going on? Do they know? People in other countries, well, they know because of media. Okay. But they think it's crazy that the U.S. considers that they have an opioid crisis. They know what a healthcare crisis looks like. When I was in Burkina Faso, which is in Western Africa, their big crisis that they're used to is Ebola. Right. The hemorrhagic fever. And the way they would treat Ebola is the difference between how we would treat Ebola here from CDC is what they would do is circle the community with a wall of fire, kind of like you'd do a fire break in a forest fire. Circle the community with a wall of fire. Nobody gets in, nobody gets out. Ebola epidemic right there in their own community. Several people die, but that stops the infection. Okay. But now, with iPhones everywhere, the patient that came from Burkina Faso that got out and came to Houston and subsequently died, a lot of people are upset with that guy because he, on his questionnaire that he filled out to get on the plane, said he had no fever and he had no contact with anybody with an infectious disease. When in fact, when he showed up at the airport, he had a temperature of 103, and he took ibuprofen for it and brought it down. And the day before he got on the airplane, he carried the dead body of a pregnant woman with Ebola out of the city. Wow. So people were like, well, he lied on his entrance papers. And I'm like, but consider, if you're in
Burkina Faso, and 9 out of 10 people are dying of Ebola, and you have an iPhone or somebody shows you on the internet that there's treatment available in Houston, Texas, or Atlanta, Georgia, wouldn't you try to get there?
Yeah.
And so he was doing exactly that. But the interesting segue of that is I know a physician who's been over in Burkina Faso now for 22 years with Doctors Without Borders.
Mm-hmm.
And he went over there because he had a heart for HIV, AIDS. And the penetration of HIV is about 50% in Africa. So you see a lot of young parents that will die and leave the kids as orphans, and all of them are infected with HIV because they didn't know safe techniques for STD transmission. But this doctor, when he first went over there, all he had available to treat HIV was AZT, which is the first antiretroviral drug. And now we have 22 different antiretroviral drugs. So all he did was think outside the box. Well, I got all these Ebola patients here, and they have a limited amount of antidote at the CDC. So he just started treating. He looked on electron micrograph pictures that he got on the internet and said, lo and behold, Ebola looks the same as an RNA virus as HIV. So he started treating his Ebola patients with HIV medications, and what do you know? 9 out of 10 of them survived.
Wow.
I mean, that's just using a tool that you have and not feeling restricted.
Right.
So other countries think it's crazy that the United States has any problem with opioids because they're aware of what occurs in Africa and what occurs in Europe and what occurs in South America, where they buy all their medications typically over the counter, and a clerk asks you what your condition is, whether it's malaria or whether it's pain, and hands you a medication, you pay for it right there. There's not a medical interaction. And then they're limited in their scope. In South America, the patients walk around chewing coca leaves, which is cocaine.
Okay.
In Malaysia, the people drink tea with kratom in it.
Yes.
And the interesting thing about kratom is, depending on how many cups of tea you have, it can either wake you up, it can put you to sleep, it can relieve pain, or it can relieve withdrawal from an opioid type effect. So it has 4 different effects depending on dose.
Okay.
And they understand that.
Okay. I want to change now from their point of view and start focusing on a little bit from within the U.S. When we were speaking, you mentioned that the death rate within the U.S. from opioids, how many are actually from first-time opiate prescriptions?
Well, that's a little misleading for first-time opioid prescription, but I will tell you that the risk of death from let me just tell you, the billboards that are out there say 4 out of 5 heroin addicts started with a prescription medication.
Right.
The true statistic, that's a propaganda-driven agenda.
Mm-hmm.
The true statistics, and they know it, CDC knows it, FDA knows it, is 88%, almost 9 out of 10 patients or users of an opioid prescription have never seen a doctor for that. They got their first opioid from a friend or took it from their parents' medicine cabinet or got it someplace else.
Okay.
So the true statistic for a pain patient or anybody with an acute painful condition that is given a prescription for a pain medication, takes it as prescribed, and it was prescribed for them, the true statistic is they have a death rate of 0.02%.
Wow.
You have a risk of being struck by lightning of 0.03%.
Wow.
So you have a higher risk of being struck by lightning or of having any issue. And they talk like anybody who gets a prescription opioid after a tooth extraction or a broken arm is going to automatically turn into an addict.
Right.
We know from back in World War I, World War II, and even Vietnam that the true percent that actually become addicted is 1%.
Right.
So herein lies the true mathematical numbers is you've got 110 million pain patients in the United States. 26 million of them are on chronic daily opioids. and 1 million are addicts. And if you take away prescription opioids, they're going to take something else.
Right.
In fact, that's what has filled the void. I harken back, if you talk about just analogous situations, the United States announced a specific time and date that we would withdraw troops from Iraq.
Mm-hmm.
And what filled that void was terrorist activity.
Okay.
So now the United States, in the last 3 years, not through an FDA mandate, and they're the only one with authority, but through a DEA, through the DOJ, reduced opioid prescriptions by 50%. But the death rate has increased 652%. And people are like, oh, how can that be? Those are divergent curves. That doesn't make any sense. You reduce the supply and the death rate went up. If you really wanted to see the death rate go up, you'd make every single prescription pain medication illegal.
Right.
And then the only thing people could do is doing what they're exactly doing today, is taking the fentanyl, the heroin, the methamphetamine, the cocaine, the illicit drugs.
Mm-hmm.
And China and Mexico are just filling that vacuum that was created by us.
Well, and who is behind the opioid trade or opiate trade?
Trade or crisis?
Well, both.
The historical opioid trade, it was an opiate trade, and that's confusing to some people, opiate
Yes.
versus opioid.
Mm-hmm.
Opiate is naturally occurring and opioid is synthetic. So I don't like the term narcotic because that, you talk about narcos and has a bad connotation. But if you just use pain medication,
Yes, I agree with
prescription pain medication is a more reliable term. Well, it's interesting that most of the original opiates, morphine, heroin, those came from poppy seed extract, and that grows in specific areas of the world, notably Afghanistan. And so historically, our CIA and our government, our military, have guarded those fields because that was a cash crop for our government and them.
Okay.
So that was just like growing cotton in the southeast. Now, they still are guarding those fields, even though we're not engaged there in war, but they're still guarding those fields through 2020 under the current contract.
Really? Wow.
Yes.
And
And why would you ask that they would be guarding poppy seed fields?
Right. Why would they?
Well, to protect your crop.
Is it
So
that important of a crop? I mean...
Well, it's important because opiates have been used successfully and safely for 6,000 years.
Right.
And it's important to that extent, but what has supplanted the lack of importance for opiates, the poppy seed extract from Afghanistan, is the ability to construct or manufacture synthetics.
Right.
So when people hear Demerol, methadone, Ultram, fentanyl, those are all,
Analogs?
Mr.
Or...
Peabody.
Yeah.
Yeah, they're sitting in the labs. Fentanyl is analog is a good term because lay people think that fentanyl is a very dangerous and highly potent medication, singular. But what they don't understand is fentanyl is a whole series. In fact, there are 114 analogs, which is change a different allele or chemical structure on it. And 66 of those 114 have been approved by the FDA for human usage.
Right.
But now, since you have all these different capabilities, you now see what happened several years ago in the methamphetamine crisis, if you will, has now become or begat the opioid crisis, because now everybody can just go on the internet, find the ingredients, find the recipe, and they can make their own meth, they can make their own fentanyl.
Yep.
And so the danger, if it was just straight fentanyl citrate like what we use medicinally in the hospitals, not a problem. That's a parenteral medication, or can be sublingual or spray. The problem lies in the fact that illicitly manufactured fentanyl coming in from China and Mexico don't have a neat little stamp on it with an F that says it's fentanyl. So that it's colored blue, and it looks like an oxycodone 30 or a Percocet tablet. So you take your typical pain medicine that now can't get their regular prescription, and they have no option, so they're at the bus station or stadium downtown, whatever city they live in, and somebody says, hey, I can get you some Oxycontins or oxycodone, and they take their usual dose of 4, not realizing it's fentanyl stamped blue with your number on it. Looks just the same to you, but it's 100 times more potent.
Right.
And here's your death rate.
Right.
Just skyrocket.
And I heard it's
and
also
there's no
easy
way
to hide.
Stop that.
Yeah, yeah. When they're
Absolutely.
because they can basically create a lot of this. You don't even need a large quantity, but a large quantity basically, and it's very small, and they ship it and they can't see it. And then the other thing is, like, when you're talking about when they just change one molecule of this, when it's coming through, the customs thing, if that's not on their list, and tell me if I'm wrong here, but if it's not on their list, then that's not an illegal drug or a problem. So they'll put it through.
That's exactly right. Right.
So
yes.
It's very, very interesting. How, first of all, is there an actual issue with opioids or opioids? And why hasn't if there is, why hasn't the government gotten this under control?
I will say that there is certainly an issue, but it has nothing to do with pain medication. It has to do with addicts.
Okay.
And addicts will huff gasoline or Ready Whip or Pam cooking spray or anything to achieve a behavioral effect. That's a neurobiological disorder, and in fact, it's a disease process, as is chronic pain. So if you want to castigate that population morally, you are in violation of the American Disabilities Act. You're saying that a addict who can have pain can't be treated, and a pain medication or chronic pain patient can't have access to pain medication because we don't want you to become an addict or because we're afraid of the 1 million addicts.
Right.
So we don't really have a crisis of opioids or pain medications, but we do have a crisis of addicts.
Okay. Is that the only relationship between, like, the meth crisis and the opioid crisis? Or is there other?
Well, the relationship is easy access and easy manufacturing, and the ability to bring it in through our ports, which are hardly... you live on the ocean?
Yes.
And you've seen the seafaring vehicles with the big crates?
Yep.
That's how most of our drugs come into the United States, is through the southern border and through the port system.
Okay.
Even through Canada. So easy access, easy manufacturing. We had a methamphetamine production plant, if you will, in a local hotel here in my hometown about 4 to 6 years ago, where on the 4th floor in the presidential suite, a group of people were manufacturing just in a stovetop cooker methamphetamine, breaking it up and selling it in a 4 or 5 state region.
Wow.
For 6 weeks and paying $900 a day in cash for that room.
Wow.
I mean, it's a presidential suite, so several rooms. And a maid smelled ammonia and thought one of the other maids had dropped their Windex. So she opened the door, even though it said do not disturb, and they found this meth lab that had been there for 6 weeks.
Wow.
So, I mean, you can make that on your stovetop, and now that you could manufacture fentanyl, you could do the same thing, and that's what you're seeing throughout cities and distribution.
Well, and let me ask you, so with the meth crisis, the way they kind of cut that or stopped it was because, I mean, you could basically look underneath your sink and make this kind of stuff if you knew the process. And one of the stuff that they used was Sudafed. So in all the pharmacies, you weren't allowed to get that, and now you have to, like, sign your name, and they have to look at your driver's license and stuff like that. Is that how they stopped it?
That's correct.
Okay, and is it
Yeah,
that
they
easy to...
slowed down the production of illicitly manufactured methamphetamine that way by stopping the raw materials.
Okay.
If you wanted to do the same thing with morphine, you'd burn the poppy seed fields in Afghanistan, except you'd be destroying a crop there that they need, so they don't want to do that.
Okay.
But you can't stop the home chemist that wants to make methamphetamine or fentanyl or any of the other synthetic opioids, Demerol, Ultram, methadone at home.
Okay.
If they have the ingredients.
Let me ask you, what is the DEA's role in the opioid crisis?
Well, the FDA is the only policymaker at the national level that is allowed to render an opinion on maximum dose. And the FDA is on record of having said there is no maximum dose for an opioid or pain medication because people have tolerance. The DEA is the enforcement arm of the Department of Justice. And the original Controlled Substances Act was developed to stop the interdiction or stop the influence of foreign illegal substances, methamphetamine, marijuana, and cocaine from coming into the United States. And that's what it was designed for. And several years ago, the DEA, under the Department of Justice, decided to, hey, we already have a database because of prescription drug monitoring programs. We can track every healthcare provider electronically, just on a computer, and see how much they're prescribing. Then we can know their patients. They're all listed there, their addresses, their phone numbers, and they're easy targets. So somewhere along the line, they decided to target physicians, and that's what you're seeing now is many, many doctors being prosecuted or persecuted for prescribing pain medication for their patients who now have no place to turn.
Right.
It's that whole form of treatment is drying up. Despite the fact that the CDC guidelines are purely voluntary and supposed to be non-restrictive, but most physicians are so fearful now of this chill effect that they're saying, well, I'm not going to prescribe over 90 MMEs because that's the law. Well, it's not the law. Show me that law. It doesn't exist. But they're afraid, but where they're running up against a brick wall is that pharmacies, insurance companies are all holding to that fact because they don't want to pay for over 90 MMEs.
Right.
Or they don't want to be held liable. So somewhere along the line, they've gotten confused. It's just misinformation, and there's nothing to do with a law there, and CDC can't make law.
Okay. All right. We have a caller. Do you mind taking a call quickly?
That'd be fine. Thank you.
Okay. Caller from area code 224. What is your name and what's your question for Dr. Henson?
Hi, my name is Kate, and I have a question, and I wanted to ask his opinion about something, please.
Sure.
I went with my elderly mother. She's 84 years old. Took her to a wound clinic. She had a medium-sized, open wound that would not close. So the doctor put a suction machine on her for closure. And when we left, she was given a 3-page packet explaining the opioid crisis and basically why she wouldn't be getting pain medication for her painful procedure. And I feel like it's all propaganda, and I don't know how to fight that. Is there something we can do when we're handed, and it is misinformation from the doctor. It basically says that, she will possibly get addicted to the medication if they were to give it to her, so they will not.
Well, I appreciate the question, and that you nailed it when you said that's propaganda, because that is an agenda-driven message that has no science to back that up. We've seen this historically. Alcohol prohibition in 1920 to 33. We've seen it when HIV first came out. Everybody didn't want to have anything to do with AIDS patients. Oh, you must be morally wrong. And then with the gay community, even, that's got to be a moral issue. So now we see this moral issue that pain medication is wrong. Pain medications are good and have been used reliably for 6,000 years, and for them to pontificate and give you a packet that this will addict your mother, even though she's 84 years old, and to withhold pain medication from your mother for a painful condition as you're getting secondary intention healing is torture. The UN, United Nations General Assembly has said that. That's in their policy, that to withhold treatment of pain from any human is not only inhumane, but it's torture and unnecessary when we have the means to be able to treat that. The other thing that they're doing now, I'm an emergency room physician, but if you go to an emergency room, let's say you had a strep throat or some acute medical condition, and they will ask you, do you feel safe in your home, and do you have any guns in the home? And my response has always, the nurses ask those, or the techs getting the information up front, but I would always say, you don't have to answer that. It has no bearing whatsoever on the treatment of your strep throat. And it's just a means of tracking data and keeping you under their thumb. Just like they tried to do with alcohol prohibition. You know what happened? We've seen this story before. We know how this book ends. Alcohol prohibition originally, back in the 20s, they thought it was a real social and moral problem. So what the fix was, and most people our age don't understand this, but what the fix for alcohol prohibition is, how do we denature alcohol? And that's just a code word for we'll put poison in the alcohol so that alcoholics won't take it. And what happened is they killed millions of people by poisoning the alcohol. And that's an unintended consequence, just like what we're seeing today with pain medications and the reluctance to treat pain. There have actually been several lawsuits now which are considered a malpractice by omission. And there have been at least 4 cases where end-of-life issues, where maybe a cancer patient had severe bone pain or RSD, any sort of acute painful condition, shingles, and withheld pain medication, that is grounds for a negligence malpractice suit. So it's best to be armed with information when you go in there. If you have any sort of condition like that with your mother or any other family member, and say, can you explain to me the science behind the CDC guidelines, or where is the law that states that? And if there's a 1% risk of addiction, how do you explain all our people that came back from World War I and II that never got addicted and became presidents and senators and never had any issue? If you took 100 patients and put them all on an opioid for 100 days, 100% of them would be dependent, so they would experience some physiological withdrawal. One person would become addicted, and that's a behavioral issue related to a gene.
Mm-hmm.
Kate, did you have any other questions?
May I ask another question?
Yeah, sure.
I've had RSD, body organs. I have it now. It's been 27 years. And I am going through a very harsh taper from my doctor, and spoke with him yesterday, and he told me that, and he stated this as a fact, that your mu receptor sites cannot absorb opioids over 90, and he gave the amount of 90 milliequivalents of morphine, and that after that, it does absolutely nothing for chronic pain patients. And he said, there's 20 years of data backing this up. And I feel like it's just all, like I said, all this propaganda's out there, and people are picking and choosing what works for their personal agenda. And it is a lot to try to overcome or fight. And I'm not quite sure what else to do besides bring in information. But, you know, my doctor was pretty much like, well, you're arguing with the wrong person, because there's lots of statistics to prove this, but there aren't.
There are zero statistics to prove that. And that is an opinion based out of a moral idea that that physician has to support his reluctance to treat you. And I will tell you that statistically, 8 out of 10 pain patients are undertreated. Because of fear. Doctors now fear that they will lose their livelihood or their assets, but that's neglecting patients now. And patients have an extreme fear because if I confront my caregiver, and even though I'm on a rapid taper, what if they just cut me off completely? I'm nowhere, and there are fewer and fewer. You know, I will tell you, my mentor, you may have heard of Dr. Forrest Tennant.
Yeah.
In West Covina, California. But my mentor, who was probably the grandfather of pain management, coming through World War II and then going to UCLA and essentially starting the World Health Organization's plan for what was the forerunner for methadone clinics. But he has the largest body of evidence for chronic opioid use. There is no limit above which your immune system can react like 90 MMEs. In fact, when Dr. Tennant would teach at Pain Week, he would describe, and I'll just throw in this one story. He has a neurosurgeon, that is a surgeon that operates on brains and spinal cords, that still operates today, and he is taking 10,000 MMEs daily. And most people in the media and or law enforcement or pharmacies would say that's impossible. You could not take 10,000 MMEs, you'd be dead. And that's a false assumption. That's tolerance. And he said, why, if it's a neurosurgeon, he should know very well that he shouldn't be on that degree of pain medicine. And he said, why is he on that? And he said, well, because when transferring a patient over, a surgical patient, he herniated a couple discs in his back. So he did exactly what the media would tell him to do. He got an epidural, got an MRI, was on pain medicine for a couple days, and then went and had surgery. So he had 2 epidurals, he had 2 different back surgeries. That failed and took him out of the operating room for 8 weeks at a time, 2 months to heal up. And he said, given that I've had that experience and it failed, I will never again go back to surgery when I can just take pain medication and function on it. Everybody wants to know, what is 10,000 MMEs? That's 22 tablets of 30 milligram oxycodone every 6 hours.
Wow.
And the guy operates, and I'd let him operate on my brain or spinal cord because he's a fantastic surgeon. There is no tolerance. I mean, there's tolerance, there is dependence, but there is no maximum limit. 90 MMEs was driven by the CDC recommendations it was junk science behind it. There's no science to prove any validity to 90 MMEs. That was just a number pulled out of thin air. And the data that they used said, well, there is a spike in the death rate of people that take above 90 MMEs. Well, if you look at the data, the same percentage of deaths occurred at 10 MMEs, at 50 MMEs, at 250 MMEs. So there's no science there, and they just pulled this out of their hat, and people swallowed it hook, line, and sinker, including some of our politicians.
Right. Kate, did you have anything else?
No, that's all. I really appreciate your time, Doctor. Thank you.
Right. Thank you for calling.
Certainly. Thank you, Kate.
Dr. Henson, you were raided by the DEA. Can you share what happened to you and, what your charges were?
Well, yes. I, after a 20-year career, 22-year career in emergency medicine, I have been very entrepreneurial, so I had other non-medical ventures. Mm-hmm. And so I happened to be in Texas on a business trip. So I only had my pain clinic scheduled 1 day a week on Thursdays. And then I also had a men's healthcare clinic that did hormone replacement and erectile dysfunction and wellness, testosterone, vitamins, things like that. Mm-hmm. And so I came home on August 7th, 2015, my wife was ill at the time, so she would normally pick me up at the airport, and I had a taxi cab driver take me home from the airport. And when the taxi drove into my driveway, several officers armed
Wow.
closed in behind this taxi and took my luggage, my computer, my phone, everything, and said, let me in the house, and we're here from the DEA. And they, I didn't have a key to my house because I normally come in through the garage. And so I said, I'll have to knock on the door. My wife was sick. So they said, open the door, else we're going to knock it down. I was like, wait a second, guys. I'm trying to get the door open. So two of them announced who they were. The rest just kind of ransacked my house looking for, I don't know, drugs, money.
Yeah.
They accused me of running a pill mill. I said, I'm not. They said, well, you had a patient that died. And I said, I had heard that one of my patients had a run-in with law enforcement for the third time and opted to overdose on his own medication as well as someone else's medication and some illicit substances and died. And I said, I'm sorry about that, but that I have nothing to do with that.
Right.
So at that point, they told me they could either take my DEA license or I could surrender it. And if I didn't surrender it, this was on a Friday evening. So you have no access to attorneys, everything like that. And I said, well, I want to be cooperative with you. They said they'd take me to court Monday and have the judge remove my DEA. That is a false premise that I now know. But so I just signed off and said, you can have it if you think I'm a danger to society. I said, the real danger here, though, is my patients, 125, I would see 30 on this Thursday, 30 the next Thursday, space them out over a month. So you could see 1/4 of your population every week.
Right.
I said, so the ones who I saw a week ago are just fine. But the ones who are going to run out this next week, you're forcing them into it's not even a taper, it's forced withdrawal.
Right. Yeah.
And I said, forced withdrawal has a 50% mortality rate. So if you want to discuss who do you think is of risk to society, it's not me because one patient overdosed intentionally. It's you for putting half of my patients or all of my patients at risk of death.
Right. Yeah.
From withdrawal. I said, and that's shame on you.
When did the DEA stop working with law enforcement and prescribing doctors?
That occurred in the early 2000s. In the, we went through this was my whole career span, but we went through the idea that pain was the fifth vital sign and that we were under-treating and that we should adequately address the treatment of pain in all patients. If they came in for a painful condition, and of course, in the emergency room, 90% of patients come in for something painful. And my experience throughout my entire emergency medicine career was that if we ever had evidence of a patient diverting their controlled substance from the emergency room, first thing that would happen is the law enforcement or DEA or pharmacist would come contact the doctor and say, we have evidence this patient went out and sold their medication, traded it, gave it away. That's called diversion. And so they would tell us, and we would flag them in our computer system, or we would dismiss them from our care. And that was a cooperative way to control diversion. And then once DEA and local law enforcement started attacking physicians, then they dropped that cooperation with physicians and instead started cooperating with pharmacies and the prescription drug monitoring program, which is governed by your state medical board. So that now they can monitor it all, and we will let you have your take care clinic inside your pharmacy, and you report to us the top 10 prescribers of opioids in your city. So it's a quid pro quo now that since they started targeting healthcare providers, it's not just doctors, it's nurse practitioners, PAs, but it's all healthcare providers. Even pharmacists have been charged. But now that they have this three-headed dragon of insurance companies, state medical boards, DEA, and pharmacies cooperating together, but at the expense, the unintended consequence of this is that you're cutting off 1/3 of the population who has chronic pain.
Right.
They no longer have access.
Right.
So it's very frustrating for patients. One should never withdraw treatment to save the 1%, that harms the 99%. That's a failed mission, and that's why war against drugs will never work. And the interesting thing about me traveling throughout the world is there are 7 countries led by Portugal. Do you know what the death rate from a overdose here is in the United States?
Of what? Of
Opioid is 312 patients per 1 million.
Wow, no, I didn't know.
In Portugal and 6 other countries where they have not legalized drugs, but they've decriminalized. So they've decriminalized marijuana, heroin, methamphetamine, anything. But because they said the patient is choosing to take it, so if it's not harmful to somebody else, we don't care. It's harm reduction is what they're after. And their death rate is 6 patients per 1 million.
Wow.
Ours is 312 per 1 million. And we hold ourselves out as being so much better. I don't understand that number.
I don't either. And why isn't government, our president in the United States, everybody, why aren't we looking at other countries that are being successful at this?
Part of it's pride. Part of it's because we've always done it this way. And part of it is because Congress, despite all the political jostling over red versus blue or Democrat versus Republican is a uniparty. I mean, it's basically one little cabal trying to preserve its own nest egg. And now you have a disruptor in chief that says, wait a minute, we're not just going to do things because we've always done it this way. Probably the most striking thing that you're seeing right now at the federal executive level is President Trump, how he's expressed his frustration with Sessions, the Attorney General. And that has as much to do with him recusing himself, but also how he's wanted to target states for which medical marijuana is legal. And so he's tasked Kellyanne Conway and Jared Kushner with heading up his kind of opioid crisis. And so what was voiced just this past week is, he came out with an executive order, President Trump did several months ago, I believe it was in March, to commit $6 billion to rehabilitation for opioids. That's what we're going to do is we're going to get these people into treatment, so these 1%ers, so that they won't go back to abusing opioids. But then last month, or the last quarter here, they've arrested the top 2 rehabilitation doctors in the country. So Kellyanne Conway was just saying, so we put forth this money in the budget to take care of patients that are addicted, but now you've taken away their options. So that only gives them the option to go to the street like chronic pain patients. And then all you're going to do is see unintended consequences of suicide, death. There's a lot of health effects that people suffer. That is the unintended consequences of having inadequate pain treatment. I think you yourself suffered with tachycardia, didn't you?
Yes. Yep, I did.
Which is a fast heart rate, and that's miserable. You can pass out or you can feel unsteady, but you can also get hypertension. You can get hyperglycemia, which creates a diabetic state. It drives your adrenal glands crazy because you're kicking out not only adrenaline in a fight or flight reaction to avoid pain, but you're also kicking out cortisol like crazy, your body's own inherent steroid. And so you get adrenal fatigue, if not failure. And then, of course, suicide rate has just gone sky high because people feel like they have no option.
Yeah.
Or they turn to alcohol. For years, we've noticed that mentally ill patients, whether they're depressed or bipolar or anxiety, a whole host of mental illness, which has about a 25% prevalence amongst the population, i.e. 1 out of 4 patients will have a mental illness. But mental illness was so stigmatized morally that rather than go see a physician or show up at a pharmacy and have to pick up your antipsychotic medication because you're schizophrenic, they would self-treat with alcohol or medications or food, and rather than face the stigma.
Right. Well, and I think a lot of
we've come a long way in terms of understanding now.
Yeah. And I think a lot of patients too that are being underprescribed for or not, getting the pain management that they need, they do turn to alcohol. I did for a while. Like, I mean, I drank because I didn't know how else to survive and live, because I couldn't deal with it.
Absolutely.
And it was really bad. It was really scary. And I know a lot of people are, or they're looking to other options, but it's not covering them. Like, I'm talking about CBD oil, kratom, other things. I mean, it helps a little bit, but it's not, pain medication is the one thing that's cheap and it's easy to, take, and it's safe for the most part, I believe. And, people don't have problems with it until now.
People have no problems with it. The moral side of that is, treatment centers right now, let's say they are going to prescribe Suboxone. Dr. Kolodny is a big proponent of Suboxone because it has Narcan in it, but or methadone. And people think, oh my gosh, you're on methadone. But there are doctors, lawyers, senators, congressmen that are on methadone for chronic pain, and it is a perfect pain medication, not just for withdrawal. And the reason for that is it's cheap, it's reliable, it has a long half-life of 57 hours, and it's non-euphoric. So you don't take methadone to get high.
Right.
Even if you probably have not, but Dr. Klein has, he's talked about it. If you've ever met a heroin addict, heroin doesn't get anybody high. It makes them feel nothing. And so it's an avoidance behavior is why people resort to heroin. It relieves their pain, but it just makes them feel void. They don't take it to get high.
We have a call. Caller from area code 262. What is your name and what's your question for Dr. Henson?
Hi, Dr. Henson. Very interesting information. Loving it. I have a relation in Marysville. Go Kansas.
In Kansas?
Yeah.
There you go, up in northern Kansas.
Actually, they're from Hanover.
Okay.
I've been deep into this subject, like a canal stenosis and foraminal stenosis. It's very painful now that I'm older and, arthritis, blah, blah, blah. It's rather bad. And disc punching the cord everywhere. Astronaut Walter Cunningham at the Apollo 50th anniversary said something very interesting, and that was we couldn't launch the Apollo moon rocket today because no one could agree on how to put it together because of all the committees and needed to get it done. It seems like we should have gone back to the moon by now. And he said what had changed was and he used the word fault intolerance. Now, that word can have a positive connotation that it means being careful and building corrections into things that prevent faults. But his connotation was that we were being too picky. And I was wondering, and I have gone over this word again and again, and I'm starting to love it. And since 9/11, I think things got really fault intolerant, and I think this is maybe partial explanation for the horrifying reaction to, the addict picture of addicts, which has overwhelmed everything and finally thrown out the pain patient with the bathwater. I was wondering what you thought about that word, fault intolerance.
It's the first time I've heard that, but I certainly understand that term. And you never want to let perfect get in the way of progress. So, indeed, if that keeps you, essentially I can distill that down, that what holds back so many athletes or musicians, a performer, for instance, is not their ability to succeed, it's their fear of failure. And that's what you see in fault intolerance, is that rather than risk a seal breaking or any small thing, we let perfect obstruct our ability to progress. And I think that's exactly what you're seeing with the, what I would say is a false premise of an opioid crisis. We don't have an opioid crisis. We have an addict crisis. And pain medications have been safely and reliably used for 6,000 years back to ancient Egypt and China.
When he used
without
that
any
word,
issue.
Yeah, it's been among our people. We've we're becoming more and more aware that they've been around for a very long time, and what is said about if they make addicts, then we who are pain patients would all be addicts, and I don't think
Absolutely.
any addicts come to this show, and there's and our groups at Facebook are just thousands, are getting up into the thousands. But when the astronaut said that word, fault intolerance, it was sort of a key for everything I had been feeling since 9/11. Overwhelming patriotism. Not that that there's anything wrong with patriotism, but overwhelming sort of in making an inroads into your living room. Thanks for your time, Dr. Henson. I'm really going to learn all about it.
Let me ask you,
Yeah.
are you an engineer by chance, since you referenced Apollo?
No, just a big Apollo fan.
Good. Well, let me just tell you, one of the things that we've learned a lot of things from our space missions. And one of the things that we did find out from our returning astronauts is in a non-gravity field that it straightens out the lordotic curve in the spine, lumbar spine curves and the cervical spine curves. And so our
Lordosis.
astronauts they would come back from space 2 inches taller.
Mm-hmm.
Well, where that morphed into is in disc herniation means, since you talked about foraminal stenosis, which is very painful, just like spinal stenosis, because it's pinching down on a nerve, which is like a electrical shock or a fire.
Mm-hmm.
But what we learned, I would just tell you my experience. Late in my career, I was transferring a code blue patient over in the middle of the night and heard an audible snap, like snapping your fingers, and felt something pull in my low back. And I thought I just strained a muscle, save for the fact that I heard that snap. And I thought, that can't be good. So just through adrenaline, I finished my shift, get off at 6 in the morning. That whole weekend, I could not get off the floor. I couldn't cough, sneeze, bend my head, or put on my socks. So I called an anesthesia buddy. Monday morning, he said, come in and get an emergency MRI. I'll give you an epidural. And he showed me my MRI and had 2 central disc herniations, L4-5 and L5-S1. Mm-hmm. And he said, if you haven't eaten breakfast, we'll do your surgery at 1 o'clock. And I said, wait a second. I don't think I want surgery. I've treated so many patients that have had failed surgery. I'm not going to put my health care in a coin flip. Plus, I have to work, so I can't take 2 months off. So I said, if you can get me an epidural, and those take a little bit to take effect, and get me a couple days worth of medication, muscle relaxer pain medicine. And then I did disc decompression, which chiropractors typically do, because orthopedists don't like to use that. It's a non-paying option, but you get stretched on a rack with heat and vibration, and it straightens out your lordotic curve. The analogy being, if you squish down on a jelly-filled donut and it squirts the cherry jelly out, that's your disc squirting out and compressing a nerve. But if you were able to pull on both sides of that jelly donut and create a vacuum, it would suck that jelly back in. And so that's what disc decompression does. So I did epidural, 2 days of pain medicine, 3 disc decompression treatments, and played in a golf tournament that weekend, 72 holes.
They went back in. Interesting. So those inversion tables, are those inversion tables comparable to, are useful for disc decompression?
Mm-hmm.
Yes, inversion tables are, save for the fact that when you are hanging upside down, I'm 57 now, and if you get older, it's hard to tolerate your head being down that low because of the throbbing.
Cardio.
But inversion, it's the same concept. Or you could hang upside down from a monkey bars. It straightens out your lordotic curve, creating more space in your disc space.
And once you have surgery too, and you have metal in your neck, you can't do that anymore, correct?
That's correct.
Yeah.
If you're instrumented, that's the fallacy, and I'm glad you brought that up, Janelle, is if you've been instrumented, what's called an ORIF, open reduction internal fixation, and they have rods or any sort of metal implant in you, all that does is set you up for arachnoiditis, which is chronic pain and may or may not work. There are two conditions. If you have a traumatic injury and you have bony fragments or instability of your spine, or if you have spinal stenosis or foraminal stenosis where there's just not enough space, those can be a surgical condition,
right?
Where they just have to open up additional space. But by and large, I'm not a big advocate of surgery just for relief of discomfort when medications can do the same thing.
I had expressed the L4-5, and actually there was a fragment of it spinning around in the canal, or not in the canal, but punching around on the canal. And they
Right.
saw that on MRI, fortunately. And then they did bilateral laminectomies at L345. And I actually became a surgical technician, so I enjoy all the technicality. And
Absolutely. It's fascinating tinker toys. I mean,
it worked.
Jameson rods and Harrington rods, it works very well for stability.
Yeah, they didn't fixate it. This is really weird. A part of the disc is gone now, and the joint is still stable. And the bilateral laminectomies were, made more space for the foramen, even though on the MRI it still reveals the L3-4 as severely stenosed. And actually, I turn it on once or twice or 3 times a year if I move just right. And
Sure.
and it feels like it used to, but that was curative. But I have then I was completely free to notice how bad my middle back hurt. I have a severely stenosed foramen at T11, 3, 4, and 5, and I have protruding discs at the cervical regions, and I'm just top to toe in pain. I was cut off in 2017. I broke my contract for the first time. I took a tiny piece of Suboxone because I couldn't stand the pain. The fentanyl patches would fall off, and I think some of our gang have heard this story before. And I resorted to it. I got urinalyzed, and that was that. I broke my contract, and just anyways, I'm not going to stop the fine flow of information here, and thanks for your time.
Thank you.
Well,
for calling.
excellent. I hope you can find some relief, because I think things will change now that the federal government even recognizes the void that's been filled by illicit drugs coming in, when you could stop the whole thing by just controlling the ports and allowing doctors to prescribe the medication that patients need.
I'm really surprised that I had been I thought I was alone. I was saying for a couple of years, don't throw out the chronic pain patient with the opioid crisis, and I thought I was alone. And I had been on Facebook, and then I touched on the right link, and all of our groups are opened up to me, and man, they are working hard with to get out the true narrative. Janelle is taking the lead. Dr. Cheek, which is here at the
Doctors of Courage.
Yeah, and she's listening now, and
that's a tremendous
found
site
Dr.
for
Klein,
you.
Dr. Ibsen, and there's really a great, enormous effort, and we're defining our terms. We're finding out exactly what we're looking at here, and I've been amazed because I've only been exposed to this great, this effort to get my medicine back, which I take very personally. And I adore everyone, and so I hope that we can work. Yeah.
Let me tell you something about numbers, since you brought up that you thought you were alone. I thought this only happened to me and one other doctor that I had heard about many, many years ago, and then I reached out to Linda Cheek, Dr. Cheek, on doctorsofcourage.org, and find out that this is happening all over the United States, the oppression of physicians, but in a strictly numbers game, the U.S. population is said to be roughly 330 million people.
Yeah.
110 million suffer with chronic pain. That's 1/3 of the population.
Yes. Could use some sort of opiate relief.
Now, let's assume that half of those are Republicans and half are Democrats. That's 55 million people on each side of the street, right?
Mm-hmm.
In the 2016 election, Donald Trump won with 63 million votes. If somebody said, this is an important voting block of 55 million people, and that thus far there's only one person that is in politics that has stepped up and said, hey, this is an important constituency because I'm going to be there someday. I'm going to have chronic pain, and I don't want to throw out every option that then I'm going to need as our population gets older. So numbers do matter.
I love the idea of getting just a large portion of the population informed. What was I going to say? There's thousands of us right now, and healthy people. This is what I wanted to say.
Millions, yeah.
Well, the people in pain, but the ones showing up at our groups. the ones that are, saying true narrative, false narrative. And the healthy people are very hard to pull into the conversation.
Yeah.
Unless you've experienced, I would have told you, I told you my experience with herniating my discs.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
As an ER physician, and that's what promoted my idea of a practice including all types of different options. Because I would, as an emergency physician, if I ever saw somebody with a herniated disc, I would say, you need to go get an epidural and go see a neurosurgeon. They can fix that. Because that's what we're taught as allopathic physicians, is there can be a medicine or there can be a surgery that'll fix that. But then it happened to me, and I said, wait a minute, I don't want to have the surgery if I can treat it non-invasively and not miss any work. So we have to open up to prolotherapy, to acupuncture, to chiropractic, which is the disc decompression, to nutritional therapy. There are a lot of ways to practice what I call integrative medicine, where you don't say, well, I'm only going to wear a brown suit like the Fly. Jeff Goldblum. I'm going to reach out to my constituents, my patients, and I'm going to ask them if they've taken a medicine before or if they've had some sort of treatment before, ice therapy, ice baths, aromatherapy, what works for you, because we'll do that. Each individual is an individual makeup and how they react, both from how they metabolize the pain medication or how they deal with pain.
Pain medicine is so uninvasive. I've heard some great things from people about chiropractors. That's the first thing I did when in 1975 or no, it wasn't 75. I noticed my back going in 75. I was born in 62 like you, 61.
Yeah, you're an old guy like me.
Yeah. Maybe it was 83, 85 or something. The first thing I did for my back after I, couldn't stand it anymore was go see a chiropractor. And after the adjustment, it was noticeably worse. And then I started reading up on things. And I don't know if it's the stenosis or my tolerances. The nerves are just too close to things they shouldn't be close to because, of course, all nerves are threaded. I need some water.
Right.
Exquisitely. And, are surrounded by fat. And you can't press on the nerve at all for any reason, if it, or you will know it. And the
average layperson should understand. Yeah, the average layperson should understand what they've experienced from a child of inadvertently striking their crazy bone. Their ulnar nerve, their elbow when they bump it on the table, and it's like zing. Well, imagine that going on 24 hours a day if you are a sufferer from foraminal stenosis. That if you touch that nerve, it's going to set you off. It's going to wake you up. It's going to keep you from having an active sex life, an active work life, an active enjoyment life if you have hobbies. It just destroys all aspects of life.
There's like 15 of them that are on the MRI are said, minimal, mild, and there's 2 that are severe. And I think they're worse than that. And it's probably one wouldn't be so bad, but I think it's the concert of all this abrasion that is my problem.
It's a cumulative effect.
Nothing worked better than oxycodone. I still couldn't work, or I would override the effect. But morphine didn't work, oxymorphone didn't work, fentanyl was not strong enough. But oxycodone, for some reason, fit was the key that fit in my slot. Thanks very much, Dr. Henson.
I'm glad you brought that up, because that bears an important feature is some people can take Dilaudid and some people would prefer to take Flexeril. Morphine doesn't work for everyone. And so the best thing a physician can ask a patient is, have they ever had this condition before, whether it's a toothache or a herniated disc, and what did you do for it? Was that effective? Well, no, the Lortab made me so tired I couldn't function, so I didn't care about the pain, but the oxycodone really worked, or the fentanyl gave me a rash or fell off. So you ask the patient...
What you said about listening was beautiful, and I kind of discovered, I think it must, maybe one doctor had said it before, that doctors need to first be observers.
Absolutely. Robert Hoffman was my doctor. That was the professor of history of medicine at University of Kansas, and he was brilliant.
Thanks so much for your time.
Because he taught us to listen. Yes, sir.
Thank you for
calling. He did. You're welcome. Bye.
Let me ask you, what do you think about Dr. Andrew Kolodny?
Well, Dr. Kolodny is a brilliant physician.
Mm-hmm.
I think perhaps he is not misinformed per se, but misguided somewhat, and it's kind of a nice segue from the previous caller saying that morphine didn't work on him.
Mm-hmm.
So it fits into a patient like a keyhole, and a key is a certain medication will react with a certain patient, and that's their key to success. That being said, Dr. Kolodny understands receptor technology and how things work. He's a huge advocate for Suboxone.
Right.
And Suboxone conceptually is a wonderful drug. Suboxone is buprenorphine with naloxone mixed with it.
Correct.
And consequently, there's a little bit of a receptor antagonist involved with every agonist. What that means to a chronic pain patient, though, Suboxone will keep them from having the desire to have more opioid,
Right.
but it can also throw you into intermittent withdrawal several times throughout the day.
Okay.
And so conceptually, it's almost like a abuse deterrent medication like they try to do with OxyContin. Make it so you can't crush it, to snort it, or do whatever they do with it, inject it. And so they made Suboxone. They said, we'll just, you see it right now, that if you go in to get your pain medication, they want to make sure that you have Narcan.
Right.
Spray at your home if you have an opioid in the home. And that is the reason that they do that, and that's why Dr. Kolodny, likes Suboxone, because the antagonist is built in with every dose. Now, buprenorphine, I will tell you, Suboxone is the most widely abused
Yes.
medication in prison systems, and it's horrible to come off of. It's horrible to withdraw from, whereas methadone has no euphoria, has a long half-life, so even if you forgot to take it, as you withdrew slower, it withdraws slowly.
Yes. Somebody asked what
So
the
methadone's a
half-life
much
is.
better drug.
What is the half-life of methadone? There is
57 hours on average.
Okay.
So you're talking 4.5 days, which is why it's a beautiful medication for methadone treatment clinics, because if you have a medication that's half-life is 4 to 6 hours and you run out on a Friday, you're going to withdraw on Saturday, Sunday until you can get back into the clinic on Monday.
Right.
And most of them are open Saturday mornings now. But let's say you were out of town, or weather, Joplin tornado, something like that happened. If you're on methadone and you've already reached steady state, which occurs in a couple weeks, where you build up 4.5 times the half-life and you have steady state, then if all of a sudden you were on a trip and didn't have your methadone with you, because of the long half-life, you wouldn't abruptly go into withdrawal. It would smooth out for you to where you could have time over 3-4 days to get back to treatment. So it's a beautiful thing to cover a weekend, or if you have a hitch in your schedule, like a flat tire, or
Right.
you have to stay overnight because of weather, snow.
Can you die from withdrawal?
Oh, absolutely you can.
You can.
You can
'Cause
have-
people have told me you couldn't.
From withdrawal, what you get is severe, sudden cardiac collapse.
Okay.
You can die of shock. And then you can also die because if it's abrupt withdrawal, it shuts your adrenals down. It's called adrenal crisis. Are you familiar with the medication prednisone?
Yes. Steroid.
Oral steroid or Kenalog, yeah. Steroids, your body normally makes steroids through your adrenal glands if you have functioning adrenal glands, little tiny walnut-sized organs above your kidney. If you were started on prednisone, let's say for poison ivy, we'll throw that out, and you've been on high-dose prednisone, you can take that for about 5, maybe to 7 days. But if you're a COPDer, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, and you're on 40 milligrams of prednisone every day so that you can breathe and don't get into spasm, and you've been on it for more than a week, then you have to taper off that slowly, because your adrenals are already, the amount of steroid in your system is being monitored by your pituitary gland. And so it's surveying how much steroid you have in your system. And so if you have all this exogenous steroid in your system, the adrenals take a vacation. But it takes them about 2 to 3 days to gear back up the manufacturing plant. So if you don't taper down and allow the adrenals to start producing steroid again, and you just abruptly withdrew steroids, you'd throw somebody into adrenal crisis, and they would drop their blood pressure to 60. They'd pass out. They'd have no energy, and you would think that they had gone into shock. And the only treatment, you could flood them with IV fluids, but give them 3 or 4 liters does nothing. But you give them steroids, IV steroids, in whopping doses, and they come right out of it. So you can put somebody into adrenal shutdown with withdrawing pain medication or abrupt withdrawal of steroids.
Okay. What else do I want to? I wanted to go back to Dr. Kolodny. Why is he pushing that one thing so much, like Suboxone? Does he have an actual, financial gain in it? Do you know of? I mean, why can't he push any opioid? Well, because isn't that kind of causing the problem right now?
And it may not be considered a financial gain, but I think those of us who would hear that would say, he had rehabilitation houses.
Right.
And that's what they
Phoenix
prescribed.
Housing, yes.
So Phoenix House, yes. And so Phoenix House were rehabilitation houses that had multiple patients there that were withdrawing, and they could do medically assisted treatment, which is use something like a methadone or even benzodiazepines. But Suboxone was the new kid on the block that this is perfect because they can't overdose on buprenorphine because it has naloxone in it.
Right.
I'll tell you though, if you were on Suboxone routinely, so that you didn't, many people are well managed on very low dose Suboxone or very low dose Narcan for that matter. But if you were on regular Suboxone on a daily basis to keep you from escalating, and you had to go in for a procedure like a colonoscopy, they would tell you to stop your Suboxone 72 hours in advance of the surgery and get your doctor to prescribe just a straight agonist to buprenorphine and take buprenorphine for 3 days prior to, because they didn't want to, by giving you IV fentanyl or Dilaudid or morphine, to throw you into withdrawal. And that's exactly what would happen. You're in the middle of surgery or a procedure and they throw you into withdrawal, which has a whole host of instabilities.
Let me ask you this too. I mean, does Kolodny or Dr. Kolodny believe that that chronic pain patients should be on Suboxone? I mean,
he's advocated that chronic pain patients that if you had to get down to one medication, that it should be Suboxone for everybody because it has the built-in antagonist, naloxone. And that's where our previous caller said, but Suboxone doesn't work for everyone.
Right.
So, you can't have all red cars. Some people like blue cars. And so some people like oxycodone, some people like Norco, some people like, Flexeril, some people like Ultram. Ultram's not even an opioid. And the reason that Ultram's had so much trouble is because of its invariable metabolism. It breaks down, Ultram as its parent compound has no effect on a human, but when it metabolizes, it breaks down into venlafaxine, which is an antidepressant, and a mu receptor agonist like morphine. But you don't know if it's 90% antidepressant, 10% pain medicine, or if it's 10% antidepressant and 90% pain medicine. So that variation throws patients into havoc with Ultram.
Okay.
You can't have a one key fits all, and that's, to me, the only issue with Dr. Kolodny. He's a brilliant man, but Suboxone can't be the solution for every patient.
Right.
And the unintended consequences, one, it's very expensive, and two, is it's horrible to withdraw from.
You also, can you share your relationship with Dr. Horry and her role in the opioid crisis?
Well, my relationship with Dr. Horry is she's a fellow emergency room physician.
Right.
And she's down at Emory University in Atlanta, Georgia, which is home of the CDC. And they have a fabulous teaching hospital. They train a lot of the residents, like Vanderbilt, and of course they're home of the CDC. So they are the purveyor of all things that are evidence-based for infectious disease, like Ebola, like hantavirus, rare disorders that patients can sometimes come up with. She has been a practicing emergency physician, and her kind of subspecialty, you can have kind of facets if you're in a teaching hospital of your expertise. If you want to do musculoskeletal emergencies, but her facet of interest, to her credit, I might add, is she was in charge of taking care of abused spouses and children.
Okay.
Many times, whose first appearance is through an emergency room with an unusual bruise pattern that is typically said, "Oh, I fell down the stairs and hit my eye on a doorknob," and all of us are like, "Oh, really?" And they're getting battered at home, and so she was in charge of battered spouses, and that is a noble. That's almost like the Me Too movement.
Oh yeah.
Sexually abused people,
Right.
and so that was her credit. And so the FDA didn't come to her, but the powers that be in government said, we need a authoritative expert with street credibility. There you go, Emory, CDC, and we want you to author this paper. And we want you to say that 90 MMEs is the official dose above which no one should ever exceed.
Right.
And her position as an emergency physician is, since what we do is treat pain, is, wait a minute, that has no science. Why would I say you should only do this? And they said, because we want to be able to help fund your research here at Emory. And so I think it's safe to say, I'm not being accusatory, but it's safe to say you can always follow the money.
Right.
Where there's a benefit, whether it's in Congress, whether it's to a physician who wants to use a specific cardiovascular drug or stent, follow the money. Who's paying them?
Right.
I will just tell you the difference from an emergency room physician, and she's one just like me, is that there's a huge difference if you have somebody with an open fracture coming in by EMS, or they have bad second-degree burns. Third-degree burns, you feel no pain. It's burnt through. But second-degree burns, they're on fire. And so EMS, trying to be ultra-protective, love those people because they are boots on the ground, but their standard orders for like a kidney stone or something acutely painful would be to give 2.5 micrograms of fentanyl IV. And so they would call in, say in our metro area or in any metro area, Atlanta is where Dr. Horry is, and say I'm bringing in a, code red 50% burns, and any emergency room physician would say give 50 to 100 mics and repeat it in 5 minutes until you get on top of the pain, and then back off, because the only risk to that patient is respiratory depression, and you're in a truck, so you can bag them or you could even intubate them. But you should not withhold pain medication. That's the whole idea of risk mitigation or harm. You should not withhold pain medication for fear that you're going to depress their respirations if you're going to make them more painful. So, but yeah, there's a grant involved, and I don't think she would ever say that 90% was absolute. And she wrote, if people read the CDC guidelines, it's a recommendation for initial dose. It has nothing to do with chronic pain, has nothing to do with palliative care.
Well, and there's no real research behind any of this. Is that correct?
It's junk science. There is no research. The research that they came out with was that there was an increased death rate above 90 MMEs. But if you look at the raw data, there's two things I should mention. If you look at the raw data, that same death rate existed at 10 MMEs, at 500 MMEs. It had nothing to do with the drug level. The other thing that came out recently was the study that was put forth that said Tylenol or ibuprofen did much better for chronic pain than opioids.
Right.
And that was also junk science, because what they used in the double-blind study as the placebo type effect, which was a non-opioid, which it is Ultram, which has an opioid effect. So you can't compare treating somebody with a mu receptor agonist like Ultram with somebody that's just taking Tylenol.
Right.
It was not an apples to apples. So that's all been junk science. Hyperesthesia is what you're referring to, or the one Kate said, that the doctor told her above 90 MMEs, her immune system wouldn't even respond to that. That has no scientific basis whatsoever.
Right. Let me ask you this. When you were in medical school, did you ever imagine, with the current atmosphere of today, did you ever imagine that this would happen? And how do you see this all playing out?
When I was in medical school, I never would have envisioned this happening, because as you go through first 2 years of basic sciences, you're learning, the building blocks before you get to clinicals. And so my foundational building blocks were Dr. Hoffman saying, listen to your patients. Mm-hmm. They will tell you what's going on. If they say they have pain, you better believe it, because pain is perceived psychologically, physically, and mentally. So it's not just an open gaping wound. So in your basic sciences, then you go to pharmacology and histology. But pharmacology, you learn about all these receptors, and I was stunned to find out that you're created or born with opioid receptors throughout your body, meaning that is the appropriate treatment for pain. In fact, your body produces endorphins you've heard of, like
yes.
Pregnancy or injury. Endorphins are like a naturally occurring morphine that circulates throughout your blood to treat you. So pain is a real issue and should be addressed. I never envisioned, because in medical school, that this would ever turn out like this, because the one thing that we can all, as healthcare providers, do is relieve suffering. Mm-hmm. And relieving suffering may be putting topical lidocaine on a road rash, but it may be prescribing 100 micrograms of fentanyl or a hefty dose or an adequate prescription. When I decided to kind of leave emergency medicine, had to do with the sale of our local emergency department. It was a physician-owned hospital, but also a nurse developed a policy that she did not want the emergency department physicians like myself and Dr. Horry to be primary care physicians, when in fact we are. Many people seek their care in the emergency room because it's not convenient for them to go to a doctor.
Right.
Because most acute injuries or painful conditions occur during the weekend. There's more hours.
Right.
And so we had a nurse that made a policy that no emergency physician could prescribe more than 15 tablets of any pain medicine to keep people from coming back. Well, I said, if you prescribe 15, let's just take this, for instance, a devil's advocate. Somebody has a fracture dislocation of their ankle, trimalleolar fracture, that's closed. So you step off a curb or roll your tendon, and fracture dislocate your ankle. What we would do is, with using hefty pain medicine, put that ankle back into place and then splint it up to allow for swelling, not a cast, and then make arrangements for them to follow up with an orthopedist or their primary care physician. If this happened on a Friday night, or if you were on a holiday weekend, you had 72 hours to follow up with them first thing. So let's say that you experience an ankle fracture dislocation on a Friday night, and I prescribe you 15 oxycodone. Mm-hmm. And that gets you to about Saturday night, because you're taking 2 every 4 to 6 hours because your ankle is killing you. And then you call the orthopedist on Monday or Tuesday morning, or your primary care, and you're trying to explain that you've had a miserable weekend because your ankle was broken and dislocated, and you had pain medicine that lasted you through Saturday. And I started getting calls from the orthopedists and the doctors and say, Steve, what are you thinking? Did you think an ankle fracture dislocation would heal in 36 hours?
Right.
Or what are you thinking? I said, no. And he said, well, then prescribe enough medication to ride them through the storm. And if it's a bad ankle sprain, give them enough medication to last them 2 weeks,
right,
or whatever. But don't have them call me on Monday or Tuesday. Now they're behind pain and they can't catch up, and they're pissed at me because I can't see them right away or alleviate their pain or call in a prescription for them.
Right.
I mean, it was an unintended consequence. And so the way I see this turning out, given that we have 1/3 of the population that suffers from chronic pain and a population that's getting older is that every person, not through just childbirth or, an acute injury pattern, a herniated disc, will experience pain at some point in their life. Physical pain, shingles, broken hip, spinal stenosis, any of a number of conditions. And we'll need access to something. I would say, when I was in Africa, in Ecuador, South America, and they brought a patient to me at the close of clinic one day, and we were in a remote area, and probably 4 hours in the back of a pickup truck to a regional hospital. But he came in with a machete wound from his ear down through his jaw. And so the pastor that's with our medical missions outreach group brought him to me, and it's just like his whole mouth is filleted open like a fish. And he said, "Doc, is this something you can take care of?" And I said, "Well, let me reach in his mouth, tell him not to bite me, and let me reach in his mouth, because if he doesn't have a fracture of his jaw, and this is just a skin wound, it'll be a layered closure. It's going to take me a couple hours to do that. But if it's not an open fracture, then I can deal with it." And so nurse practitioner, his wife, and I sutured that back together. But this guy's only other option was to ride in the back of a pickup truck, where he would get an infection then, and then go to a tertiary care where they might not even treat him. So you really don't know how fortunate we are here in the U.S. to have at least the tools available to us to treat pain adequately, and that's what we should be doing. So I would hope that, given the population that's going to experience pain at some point in their life, Steve Scalise got shot up, on a baseball field with multiple pelvic fractures, and is just now kind of recovering. He's back to Congress now. What a super guy. But let me tell you, he lived through some severe pain with having to deal with that, because normal, active, healthy guy, and all of a sudden he's completely sedentary while his body tries to heal. The body tries to do everything it can to heal. And so patients, just like HIV, just like gay, lesbian crowd, everything initially starts as, oh my gosh, this is a moral travesty. And then there's acceptance, and then it's common practice. And I think now we're getting traction. It'd be nice if the legal profession would get behind the chronic pain patients too, and realize that this is a form of malpractice, of negligence. And we're starting to see many, it's not a fortunate thing, but attorneys also have painful conditions, many of which are chronic pain patients, judges, police officers, to allow them to function. And they are recognizing that if not for the ability to treat pain, I couldn't function and do my job. So I have to stick up for those that have pain, because, but for the grace of God, there go I as well. So it's coming to my future.
Yeah, those baby boomers, they're going to be all right there, and then behind them, and then all the chronic pain patients. So something has to be done. Go ahead, I'm sorry.
And it's a travesty that the U.S. is known for being probably the most well adept at many things, but so far behind on treating its own people for pain. The UN has a policy on it. The FDA has a policy on it. World Health Organization has a policy on it, that it's sheer torture. They have debates upon end about waterboarding, because they consider that torture.
Right.
And it is, but so is pain, is torture. If you have the ability, in fact, Dr. Klein says this, if you have the ability to relieve somebody's discomfort, and yet you withhold that treatment from them, then you are just a tormentor. You are doing that out of sheer spite, because you want them to experience pain. And I would never, as a physician, want to be known as someone who allowed someone to suffer.
Yes.
When you reach that point, you should get out of medicine.
So we are going to wrap up here, but I wanted to give you any last words, and if you wanted to share anything else before we do get going here.
Well, it's been a pleasure being on your show and listening to the callers, and I know this is a frustrating point for many, many people. It's gaining traction through social media. I would encourage them to, if they're on Twitter or Facebook or any of the social medias, to certainly tune into your shows, particularly Tuesdays and Wednesdays with Dr. Klein, Doctor's Corner, and then your guests from pharmacists to pain patients to healthcare providers, but also on Twitter, Dr. Klein, Dr. Laird. There's a lot of chatter on Twitter because that's instant news. In fact, we see that because that's how President Trump communicates mostly, because it allows him instant access to millions and millions of people. So that's what I would like to say is this is a condition. To completely neglect 26 million people. We get terribly excited when there's a Ebola outbreak or hantavirus in the southeastern Arizona and several people die. You saw the most recent, we had 5 people die from romaine lettuce from salmonella infection in Arizona, and 200 people were impacted with painful bloody diarrhea, but 5 people died. And that creates a national crisis. But yet, to neglect 26 million opioid-taking patients in the United States, and that doesn't make a blip on the radar, it's starting to now. And we have some good attorney representation. Attorney Flannery, a lot even law enforcement are stepping up and saying, this is just wrong. How can we as a society stand as the group of people that had the ability to treat and said no? Mm-hmm. That's not what you want to go down in history as.
Right. How do you see this going down in history? How do you think they're going to look back one day and say, wow, like what do you think they'll say about this period?
I think as there's gaining traction and with information, I believe it was pharmacist Steve a week ago that said, I would rather tolerate ignorance than arrogance. Ignorance you can educate. That's just lack of information. Mm-hmm. So if we just need to educate physicians, we could teach more about pain control in medical schools, nursing schools, because there's very little taught about. I mean, you get basically 4 hours, essentially, in pharmacology about this is how pain medications work, and you need to understand half-lives, and that's why you dose them at current intervals. But then otherwise, all you learn is kind of a moral equivalent there's addicts. I will tell you, in 22 years in the emergency room, I saw less than one handful of opioid overdoses. I was more likely to see a digoxin toxicity or a Coumadin toxicity that had increased bleeding than I was to see an opioid. Opioid in pain patients are not an issue. Mm-hmm. In addicts, it is an issue. And the only memorable opioid overdose I saw was a mentally ill patient that came in with 7 fentanyl patches duct taped to his neck that he was using a blow dryer on to make them release their fentanyl quicker. And he came in unresponsive, and we bagged him and gave him Narcan, lots of Narcan, and it woke him up. But that was the only person I ever saw that intentionally overdosed on an opioid. Pain patients don't overdose on their own medications. It's too precious to them.
Right. Well, and we don't get enough right now anyway, if we wanted to.
80% of our patients, are undertreated.
Yeah.
And that's going to continue given that they've curbed pain medication prescriptions by 50%.
Right.
So.
Right. Well, Dr. Henson.
But the wheels of change occur slowly, so hopefully it's just wisdom and it's not such arrogance that we have to overcome.
Well, let me ask you one more question, because we had a few people on YouTube asking,
certainly,
what can they do? They're chronic pain patients. I mean, is there anything now? A lot of people, I think sometimes hope is our biggest thing that keeps us kind of going. What kind of hope do we have right now? I mean, how people want to know, like, how long is this going to take? What's going to happen? Are we going to ever get help?
The hope that I would instill in chronic pain patients, because you're not alone out there, is that there are millions just like you that are being treated out there. And this opiophobia has to stop, just like alcohol prohibition. And people need to be treated adequately because it's neglect to undertreat. Right now, the options that are available, it's frustrating for a chronic pain patient because current mainstream media, the agenda that they promote is that you've got to go see a pain clinic.
Right.
Well, there's not many pain clinics out there. And a pain clinic today fits under the guise of an interventional anesthesiologist, which means they give pain blocks, epidurals, shots, and very rarely, then if those fail, then they'll prescribe an opioid medication. But they have to recognize that is just one tool in their chest. If I can block a foraminal stenosis with a shot or with surgery, that's great. But if medication is what works, there should be no restriction on withholding a pain medication if that's what works for that patient.
Yeah.
So the other thing that's out there and legal in most states is kratom, or kratom, or what people describe that.
Yep.
And that has not, as of yet, been curbed in most states. And you can get that powder and drink it in tea. Medical marijuana in those states that it's legal. I will just tell you that personal experience with a patient of mine that I saw, they were never my patient. But this was a patient who was seeing a primary care physician who was managed well on 30 oxycodone a month. That's one Percocet a day. But was also smoking marijuana along with that. And that allowed them to stay on top of their pain and maintain functionality. Then they popped positive on a drug screen at their doctor's office. And to the doctor's credit, they said, hey, listen, we can't continue to do this if you're going to continue to smoke marijuana, even though it was legal in the state. It was not Kansas because we're not legal here in Kansas. But so the patient has to make then a definitive choice. Okay, I'll stay on the Percocet if you'll continue to prescribe it, but I won't do marijuana. So what do you think happened? He goes off the marijuana, and now the physician has to prescribe 90 Percocet a month so he can take it 3 times a day.
Right.
Because the synergistic effect with medical marijuana and his opioid is he could take 1/3 of the dose. Right. And you see that commonly with adjunctive therapies, whether it's acupuncture and pain medicine or physical therapy. There are integrative ways to address pain, opening foramina or taking opioids. But opioids are very safe, reliable, and non-euphoric. Only addicts take anything for euphoria, whether it's huffing gas or Ready Whip. But pain patients don't take their medicines to get high.
Right. Well, Dr. Henson, thank you so much for joining us. I hope you'll come back. I'd really love to have you back on sometime because I know
I absolutely will. And if you ever, we had a panel up in Washington, D.C. that I wasn't able to attend, but it's brilliant to have an interchange of ideas. So I would just credit you, Janelle, with having your streaming show up on YouTube because there's an interaction through a chat mechanism that people can ask the questions if they can't get through on a phone call.
Right.
But it's brilliant to have Dr. Klein, yourself, Dr. Ibsen, many of the people who have been proponents of adequate pain treatment. Because we've seen what happens when patients aren't treated.
Right. Well, and I haven't really put this out there a lot yet. I don't think I've said it really on air, but in a few weeks coming up here, I'm actually going to be launching a network and full of hosts, shows on. I don't know if you've listened to last year, but I've tried to touch on each topic within health and wellness. Anything that, whether it's mental or whatever. And so the show basically was to give everybody a taste of what I want the network to be. But we are going to be having tons of different shows with different hosts to cover everything. In case if you don't like what I'm talking about, you could listen to the other thing. But the one thing that I always want to support and push is truth, education, motivation, and supporting each other. I mean, and we all have to come together and do that.
Those are excellent pillars, Janelle, and you have all your shows archived too.
Yes, I do.
So that is a tremendous resource, and you have a lot of links on your website.
Yep. We're going to be having a blog coming up
people
here.
People should attend that.
Yeah, and we're also.
I think what we'll end up doing is having not only a consortium of attorneys, doctors, pharmacists, all people who have a vested interest in being able to relieve suffering, and you'll see people pool resources, whether it's information or that they can just be supportive of each other, but it's going to be education, information, affirmation, and support. And that's a collection of wisdom.
I couldn't agree with you more.
That must be shared.
Yeah, it does. And then once we have that, that's how you will make the best decisions for yourself individually. So
absolutely,
and that's how I see it, because in the last few years it feels like when I was going through this as well personally, I didn't know who to turn to. My doctors weren't listening to me. I wasn't getting the proper care. I didn't know where else to go, so I went on the internet, and then I just decided how else can I reach people and help people, and this is the way I've decided to do it.
Well, good for you, and thank God for the internet, because it allows
I know, right?
distribution of information and sharing.
Yeah.
Social media, if ever there was a prop for social media, it had to be the 2016 election when Trump decided to go to fireside chats on Twitter.
Yes. Yep.
I mean, that's how they were able to move the needle.
Right.
And to me, that's how 110 million pain patients will be able to move the needle too, is by coming together and not feeling so isolated, but sharing of ideas or what they've done, whether it's kratom or medical marijuana or
and my idea almost is like we would have virtual town halls, basically. Especially if you're sick, you can't go to them. But this is a way to do that we could be able to all talk, share information and get it out there. And mainstream media is not doing it, so I think there's going to be a lot of independent resources coming up that where you can find this now. So you see,
where the recent movies that have come out and the additional details about John F. Kennedy's death, he suffered from severe chronic pain and was on high-dose opioids all throughout his presidency.
Wow.
And people just need to be educated as to how pain impacts people.
Right.
And it's non-discriminatory. I mean, pastors get pain, Amish milkers get pain, judges get pain, police officers get pain. No one's immune from this.
Right.
It's not like sickle cell that just affects a certain population that has the gene. Everyone is subject to pain.
Yes. Well, thank you again, Dr. Henson, and I hope you have a great night.
Absolutely, Janelle.
And I look forward to having
you
you back on.
Thank you for your service to humanity.
Well, thank you. You've been awesome. So, have a good night.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
You too.
Con Nation, don't forget to join us next Tuesday with Dr. Klein at the Doctor's Corner, and then next Wednesday with guest Erin Elizabeth from HealthNet News, and she's also going to be discussing her, she has Lyme disease, and I believe she's in remission, so we'll hear more about that. Well, I just want to thank everyone for taking the time out of your evening to join us here at Con Nation. I'm Janelle Agway signing off until next Tuesday. Have a good night.
Listening to Conspiracies Against Wellness with your host, Janelle Elgoway. The opinions expressed on this program are those of the host and callers, and not necessarily those of EXG LLC, its employees, or sponsors. Copyright 2018 by EXG LLC. All rights reserved.